Hello and welcome to the NDTV World Economic Forum TV debate, coming to you from the World Economic Forum's annual meeting right here at Davos. It's a great pleasure to have the entire audience here with us. The subject under discussion today is inclusive growth and how India can achieve it. Frankly, the entire discussion and the debate between growth and equality is something that's age-old. It's been there for 50 to 60 years. For the first 43 years or so of India's history, India focused a lot on equality and not quite so much on growth. And as a result of that, growth levels were also quite down. And then came liberalization and a period where development and growth in particular was what was focused upon. And at that time, pro-poor policies were sometimes dismissed as being populist policies. Now India is trying to find the correct balance, that it should continue to grow and continue to grow at the rates that it is, but at the same time no one should be left out, and that the divide between the rich and the poor should be bridged. How can this be best achieved, and what are the consequences if India fails to do that? We have an absolutely fantastic panel to take us through all of this. I'm going to start by welcoming Mr. Chidambaram, who's the Minister of Home Affairs of India. He was the finance minister as well before the terrible Mumbai attack, so he's perhaps the best person in the whole of the country to have a comprehensive perspective on this. It also gives me great pleasure to welcome Zhu Min onto the panel. He's Special Advisor of the International Monetary Fund, but perhaps can also bring us some examples from what's been happening in China in this regard. China has had some fantastic success in lifting millions out of poverty. Chanda, Kochhar, it's great to have you with us, Chief Executive Officer of ICICI Bank, one of India's largest private sector banks, and the experiences that you're having there. Michael Elliott, Editor of Time International, great to have you with us as well, and Salil, Shetty, Secretary General, Amnesty International. Thank you all so much for being with us. Mr. Chidambaram, why can't if I could just start off by getting you to dive into this. India's had phases in how it approaches this entire question of growth and equality. Where do you think that debate stands today? And the government says it's following a Aam Aadmi or a common man strategy. Is that succeeding, or are there still hundreds of millions of people being left out of India's economic boom?
Government's policy is clear. This government's election manifesto was clear, and I think a number of programs that we have launched are intended to advance the goal of inclusive growth. But the fact is that these programs do not reach all of India. There are perhaps over 100 million people who are beyond the pale of these programs. So the answer to your question is yes. While the intention is inclusive growth, it's perhaps right to say that a number of people are still left out.
Mrs. Zhu, how would you approach that question?
Well, India had a fantastic growth last year, right? And 8.7% GDP growth with very strong domestic consumption growth, and also fixed capital investments growth is also very strong, 12-13%. But looking forward, I would say, how do you manage inflation in expectation is a key issue, both for growth and equality issues. Because India, after 2 years very strong growth, very much moved to the sort of a little bit of overheating phase. The output gap is very much close. And inflation is pressures here already, right? I mean, the fourth quarter inflation is 8.9%. We expect WPI, I understand India do have a different index, CPI, WPI, manufacturing. But which is pretty high, right? And obviously, currently it's still driven by food price and also a little bit of commodity price. But if the price, inflation, the pressure getting up, I think they will deter the growth, but also who will be hurt? The poor people.
Right.
Yeah, I think so. How do you manage the inflation pressure today for India's macroeconomy? It's the most important thing, both for growth and for equality.
Mr. Chidambaram, do you agree with that in the immediate future, it's the same problem that will affect both? It will affect growth and it will affect poverty and getting people out of poverty? High food prices, high commodity prices in general.
It will affect growth marginally, but what is worrying me more is that people who've been lifted out of poverty, they will be hurt by inflation. And some of those at the margin may even have to go below the poverty line. So it's important that we manage inflation very well. But if international trends, commodity prices, energy prices and say food prices are high, we will be affected. We have to factor these trends into our policies and into the budget that we make for the next year.
Chanda, Kochhar, if I could get some introductory comments from you, and especially given the fact that one of the biggest problems when it comes to poverty or getting people out of poverty is quite often access to credit, and they get into the debt trap. That's why so many of the farmer suicides happen, is because people are stuck in a debt trap and don't have access to credit. So is that something that very much exercises your mind as well?
Yeah, I think, first of all, the way to approach the whole issue is exactly what you said, that we have to treat that growth and inclusion have to work hand in hand. We don't have to go through phases of either following a path of removing income disparity or following a path of growth. In fact, examples like China have actually gone and shown that as growth takes place, poverty comes down substantially. Yes, in this whole process, giving credit to people who need to start their livelihood and who need to really follow their micro enterprises is a very important part. But, when we talk of financial inclusion, I think we just only talk of credit. But I wanted to say that financial inclusion just does not mean only giving credit. In fact, before we give credit to a person, we have to make sure that the person is capable of receiving credit and handling that credit. So the person, of course, first needs to have facility to save the 10, 20, 30, 40 rupees that he or she earns every day. To be able to find certain investment and other insurance products as well along with credit. But more than that, inclusion has to take care of the fact, have we provided the basic health facilities? Have we provided basic education? Have we trained them enough to start generating some income? And finally, have we given them food security and created an environment in the ecosystem which allows them to take the next income earning opportunity? So I think inclusion, in a way, cannot be restricted only to financial inclusion. It has to be inclusion across, making sure that the basic needs are met, and that is when people are able to participate in the growth process.
Yeah, I need the support of my friends, because last year, India have a 16% loan growth rate, which is very strong. So it's not only financial sector issue, but more general other issues. Yeah, I'm on your side.
Right. Mike Elliott, as editor of Time International, we are, of course, seeing a lot of turmoil right now, especially in Africa. That's the big subject, Egypt, all that's happening out there. How do you see this entire question of growing fast enough and at the same time making sure that people are being taken along in that growth? Is that partly behind what some of the turmoil that we are seeing?
Oh, I think it certainly is. I don't think there's any question about that. I think one of the things that we're seeing in North Africa is the consequence of having a generation of young people who feel as if there is no substantial, significant economic opportunity available to them, and I think that's very much behind what we're seeing in North Africa. I mean, I think in the context of this panel, one really has to say that for the last 10 years, 20 years perhaps, the India story has been extraordinary. I mean, it's been remarkable. It's been transformative, and I think it's an astonishing credit, actually, to all Indian authorities and commentators that the question of inclusive growth should now be absolutely center stage. I have always thought that one of the great distinctions between Zhu Min's country, between China and India, in terms of their patterns of growth over the last 25 years, didn't have an awful lot to do with the fact that China started liberalization earlier than India, didn't have a lot to do with governance structures and the ability of the Chinese government to direct infrastructure investment in a way that's much harder for reasons that we all understand in India. It had to do with three words: educate your women. And for me, the very, very early Chinese commitment to girls' education meant that it was always more likely that the first phase of economic growth was likely to be more inclusive than in those societies in which girls' education lagged.
All right. Salil, Shetty?
First of all, I should say that when I came to Davos and I saw all these posters on the streets which are talking about inclusive India, and I see Confederation of Indian Industry underneath that sign, I was really very pleased, because those of us who have been talking about inclusion as being a central pillar for the last 20, 30 years, but to see CII saying that this is important, I think that's a very welcome step. But I think, as the Minister said earlier, the challenge in India mostly is, the policies, I think, and the laws are more and more the right ones. The challenge is implementation. So, I mean, the right to information, even the new Food Security Act under discussion, the Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan, the programs, employment generation programs we have. I mean, those are absolutely the right things to do. But given the size of the country, the complexity we are facing, getting it down to the ground is a big challenge. And some of the issues, really, underlying issues, just like I said, there's a gap between policy and practice on the laws and on the government side. Societally, as a society also, we have gaps. So what we talk about is inclusion. But we have very deeply exclusionary tendencies in our society. The caste system is a classic one. But religion, and you're talking about gender, even language, or color. I mean, we're very color conscious, interestingly, as a society. And these are all exclusionary factors. So we have to do so much more to be inclusive.
Chidambaram, you want to respond to that?
Well, he's right, but we can't change our governance structure or our political system just to achieve that extra 1.5% growth. We are not an authoritarian model. We have to govern by consent. Political leaders, the elected leaders, are liable to be changed. Once in 5 years, they're accountable to the people, sometimes even sooner. These are givens, but these are givens that we have voluntarily undertaken. So I think even within this structure, there are societies which have demonstrated that they can implement programs efficiently. Yes, smaller countries, yes. But they have demonstrated it can be done. So I don't think these can be given as an excuse for not being efficient in implementing our programs. Given what we have voluntarily undertaken, we must implement the programs efficiently. And I think it can be done.
Yeah, I want to talk at great length about implementation, because that perhaps is the key problem. But is there any difference at all in the way China approaches this and India has approached this?
But I don't think there are big difference, but there is very important conceptual issues. I agree with implementation is always important, particularly in emerging market. But because situation changes so fast, every day we're facing completely new situations. Policy formation, new policy, always important. Back to India. You see, last year, government have such a wonderful policy to subsidize rural poor. So household income increased 8%. That's pushed the domestic consumption getting up. I think this is very good. It's fantastic. But obviously, that's the reason I say inflation is very important. If you have 8% inflation rate, it's washed out all the government subsidy, right? So this is important. But further, I think it's absolutely for emerging market. I myself come from emerging market. You always have to remember, the wealth creation is more important than wealth redistribution. You have to create the wealth. Okay. So where do you create the wealth come from, right? So if you're looking for India, it's 20% is in the agro, 60% in service sector, 20% in manufacturing. If you maintain this industry structure, the first issue you have to do, you have to improve the service sector productivity. A lot of community services, India, the productivity in service sector across so different. In IT, it's one sector, the telecom is one sector, but in a lot of service areas, the community services, the productivity is quite low. So income is quite low. So I do believe they need a policy to support and to promote the productivity increase in the whole service area. Then 60% of your output have a high productivity, then you will be able to give people more income.
Mr. Chidambaram, let me just get you in on the conceptual framework behind this. It is important to create the wealth before you distribute it. And that's what I started with. That's not what India necessarily believed for the first 43 years, when there was a lot of emphasis on equality. And then there was a period, including when you were finance minister earlier, when all pro-poor policies would be condemned as being populist or in some way anti-growth. Have we sorted out the concepts behind all of this? Are we conceptually clear that we should grow and redistribute at the same time, and how we should go about this?
I think both statements are wrong. I don't think in the first 30 years we condemned wealth creation. We just had a set of policies that were not helpful for wealth creation.
What's exactly the difference between the two?
We didn't condemn wealth creation.
It was almost looked down upon at one stage.
No, not quite right. Even with those policies, sectors, industries which had not been nationalized created wealth. Processing industries, textiles, sugar, all created wealth. And that wealth was distributed not very equally, but in a reasonable way in those areas where these industries created. Now, the second phase you're talking about, I'm afraid that is even more wrong. We never said that pro-poor policies are bad. When did we say that?
No, you didn't say it, but it used to be said, as he said, sometimes industry would say it, the media would say it. There used to be all pro-poor policy. There was a phase in Indian history where... is there more of a consensus now?
I didn't hear anyone say pro-poor policies are bad. I think people argued, as Mr. Chairman is arguing, creation of wealth is important because you have to create wealth to distribute it. I think today there is a consensus that growth is a precondition. But that growth must be inclusive growth, which means grow, create wealth, and distribute wealth. It's growth that generates revenues for the government. Without these revenues, how could you have launched the NREGA? How could you have launched Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan? How could you have written off farm loans to a very large amount? It's these revenues which has given us this headroom to do so.
Right.
I think today there's a broad consensus, leave out the extreme left perhaps, the broad consensus that wealth must be created. We must encourage anyone, private sector, public sector, domestic capital, foreign capital, established business families, startup units, all must be encouraged to create wealth. And that wealth must be shared more equitably. I think there is a consensus across the board.
So growing consensus. I think we are drifting towards agreement on that part of it.
Salil, you asked about the conceptual basis for this, and I think it is a very different concept when you say that a bunch of people will grow and then we redistribute whatever they generate. So if you take agriculture in India, so because we don't have one growth rate in India, we have multiple growth rates. So if you're a Dalit, you're an Adivasi, you're a minority, if you're a woman, conceptually it might sound like it's one thing. But so if the growth, and where there's a big difference with China, I think, in terms of the approach we've taken, if the growth is coming from where the majority of the population are working, you would have a different result than when you're going through this whole complex redistribution channel. Agriculture is a classic case. I think last year we were talking about 1 to 2%.
So you're saying the growth is coming in areas where only a minority of the people actually are functioning, and as a result you have to do redistribution.
I'm generalizing, it's of course not always the case, but
some of that is inevitable. You see, agriculture cannot grow at anything more than 4% average over a long period, whereas industry can grow at 12%. Services sector can grow at 12%. So whatever we do in agriculture, you cannot expect agriculture to grow at more than 4%. But if the bulk of your working force is in agriculture, their growth rates, if you look at it sectorally, will be smaller than the growth rates of industrial labor, those who are engaged in services. But that's inevitable. There's no answer to that. I know of no case where agriculture can grow over a long period at 10 or 12% a year.
Yeah, but right? I do think that there's a very good point. So the growth have to grow and supported by majority population. So the majority population will, in the first hand, share the fruit of the growth. I think this is very important. If you ask me what is the China story, I think the most important China story is the whole growth is involving the most resource we have is cheap labor.
So also, I think the other thing is that, we keep missing the other point. We talk about physical infrastructure being missing in India, whereas China has got it. But China invested for 50 years in the human infrastructure, in education, in health, and that leads to agricultural productivity and everything else. We are catching up now, but we have a backlog. I think our investments in education and health are now increasing significantly, but we are starting with a big deficit.
Chanda, do you think this is a problem? As Ruman was saying, that in China, low-cost manufacturing is really where a lot of the growth came from, and as a result, that was almost automatically allowing so many people to be employed in factories.
Yeah, I think in the long term, that's the way to make growth inclusive. That is, you get more and more people to participate in the growth process itself. Well, as you initially move on to the growth process, if there are some segments of the society that earn more, you have to focus on redistribution. But finally, to make the growth sustainable, you have to get more and more people to participate. And that is where, as I said earlier, that just if you push credit, or for that matter only redistribute money, you're never going to make people capable of participating in growth. First, they should be healthy enough to think of an employment, then they should be educated, then they should be trained, and then there should be income-generating opportunities. Again, therefore, when we say agriculture, and we may say that agriculture less than 20% of India's GDP, whereas 70% people live in the rural areas. But what we have to see is if around agriculture we then develop tertiary industries. And while agriculture may remain 20% of GDP, if rural GDP increases, you are going to, through some tertiary activities, allow more and more people, even in the rural area, to participate in the growth process.
I don't want to sound as if I'm a one note in this very interesting debate, but you brought up the topic of low-cost manufacturing in China. And just to kind of repeat my point, low-cost manufacturing in China, the massive growth in low-cost manufacturing in China from the 1980s through the 1990s to this decade would not have been possible had it not been for a massive cohort of literate, numerate young women. That's what made the factories in Guangdong province work. That's what made the factories outside Shanghai work. It simply would not have been possible for China to have built the modern manufacturing infrastructure that it has, to become the workshop of the world in the way that it has, had it not been for the fact that China committed itself to female literacy and female numeracy a long time ago.
But, I mean, in a sense, we don't want to look back. We are where we are. We are now saying, where do we go from here? And there, I think, if you take these groups of people, if they have a voice, if they are empowered, if they're able to raise the issues, and that takes us firmly into the governance. And
literacy and education helps with that empowerment, which is, I think, the point.
Education, the challenge we have now, as everybody knows, is not the quantity, it's the qualities.
Right.
Chanda, just before I shift to implementation, the point that Salil made some time back, that he's happy to see India inclusive with CII written below it. Is there now this view in Indian industry and other places that you can't have two Indias beyond a certain point? There will be massive pressures that will be built up if there are islands of prosperity while a vast mass of people is left out of that growth story. Is that now something which everyone accepts and everyone believes and says, this therefore has to be the national priority, to take everyone along?
Yeah, I mean, one is you're saying that, does India and the corporate sector believe that if this is not done, India's growth will not move? Clearly, that is an understanding. But beyond that, I think the Indian corporate sector is trying to see how, by making growth inclusive, they accelerate the whole growth process. So it's, again, I think the approach has moved not just from saying that this is a social responsibility that we have to meet, but in a way to say this should be the growth model for India going forward. Because if you actually create prosperity in the hands of more and more people, you're finally creating a market for yourself along the way.
Is that a chain, Mr. Chidambaram? The fact that people realize it's not an act of charity, it's not an act of philanthropy, it's not corporate social responsibility. It's a realization that there is no other alternative. There's no other model of development that can, in a long-term basis, work in India.
It's right, but you see, industry services can only improve the incomes and living standards of people engaged in industry and services. If 60% of your workforce is in agriculture, and that sector cannot grow at more than 4%, neither industry nor the services sector can do directly to improve their incomes or livelihood. Redistribution through the state is the only other way. The answer is to move more and more of your workforce into services, into industry. This is what China did.
Yes.
We should move our workforce into services and industry, and then what Salil shares will happen, namely that more and more people will participate in the growth process. I think our real problem is how do we shift the bulk of our workforce into services and industry.
How did China do this? I mean, we've heard some points which are made earlier, building of infrastructure, the training of people, the empowering of human capital. What were the other ways that China made sure that this happened?
Well, when China started reforms 30 years ago, right, we tried to see what was our most resource. It's cheap labor. I think that's more or less that India had, right? So how do we get this cheap labor force, get value added quickly? That's a massive manufacturing.
Yeah.
Because we quickly employ a big chunk of labor. How do we get this massive manufacturing? You got FDI, right?
Right.
So you got the FDI, so because at that time, the capital is a very scarcity resource. So you got the FDI, import not only technology capital, but also management. And with the local, the Chinese government support and the local support, and manufacture quickly pick it up. But there are few things important. I think the first issues, I very much agree with the minister says, it's quite a big, it's a clear policy agenda for India government, whether we'll be able to shift and the labor force from rural area, agro, to the service or manufacturing. And manufacturers still today only account for 20% of India's GDP. I think this is quite a big strategy for India. It's a big policy. Second, no, I'm sorry, let me finish. The second issues, then the FDI. If you're looking for last year, India roughly have, less than $70 billion dollar capital inflows, but among them, roughly $40 billion into the equity market, right? And only $10 billion in FDI. Within $10 billion in FDI, in infrastructure is rather small. And everybody say India needs infrastructure investments. And everybody say China did quite good in this area. So you have to think about why money did not go to infrastructure. So there's obviously a policy agenda needed to facilitate FDI move into India and FDI move to India, the manufacturing and the infrastructure area. It's also, I think, on the top policy agenda for India. And because international point of view, everybody believes India will have a great growth in the future.
Right. So if we all agree that this is what needs to be done, what are the reasons why it's not been done? Is it the lack of human capital that Salil was talking about, lack of female literacy that Mike was talking about, or is it something as simple as labor laws which are not conducive to the rapid increase?
Something more fundamental. Please recall what he said. We brought in FDI, we brought in capital, technology, management, and we provided the cheap labor. There was no domestic business class in China to oppose that policy. There was no fear of FDI. The domestic entrepreneurial class in China is post-reform. In India, we had a huge in Indian terms, a business lobby, which stoutly opposed FDI. Even today, there are people who oppose FDI in several sectors, not only the political class, the domestic lobby also opposes FDI. So they had a tremendous advantage because they had only the Communist Party, the party that is in government, which laid down the policy, and then there was nobody to oppose it.
But is that the only reason? What about the other factors?
For FDI. I'm talking about FDI.
I'm talking about
FDI. I'm talking about FDI. Only FDI.
It's hugely important because, again, if you go to the heartland of the Chinese industrial renaissance in the 1980s and the 1980s, you see how incredibly important FDI was. So you get a company like Foxconn, Taiwanese company, which employs, 800,000 people perhaps.
It's just crossed 1 million.
It's astonishing, absolutely astonishing. I won't dwell on FDI issues in media and magazines and newspapers because that would not be appropriate at this point. But of course the minister is right. Of course the minister is right.
Chanda?
India is an open political system. It is a democracy that's open to domestic lobbies, and surely that has been a key point.
Chanda, is that a fair place to pin a lot of the blame, or are they?
Well, I would say the challenges of democracy are different from challenges of any other way of functioning, and so are the advantages. So, what we have to consider is but what we have to consider is that in India, it's the entrepreneurial spirit that has contributed to a lot of growth. I think the debate here is not whether it's the FDI-led growth or the Indian entrepreneur-led growth. The debate is that if we have a growth, and which we have, of 8.5% and 9%, how do we share it? I think that's a separate point, whether it's an FDI-led growth or an entrepreneur. We are today saying, how do we share it? And in that, even if it's an Indian entrepreneur-led growth, as you're expanding the services sector, if we have the right amount of education given to people in the rural areas, you could have rural BPOs coming up. And that is how you get out of this constraint of saying that 20% of the GDP has to feed 70% of the population. So I think we have to ensure that we provide ways and means of people participating in those sectors that are providing growth in the country.
So let me just shift to the aspect of redistribution to the extent that happens. And there are a whole host of government measures and a whole host of government policies that are in place to take care of redistribution, including the National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme. Why don't these work? Is it because it's like a hose pipe? The government keeps pouring money in, but at the end, very little comes out because it just gets absorbed somewhere along the way by the system.
Well, that's an exaggeration.
I think it was Rajiv Gandhi who first said it, and that was almost 20 years back.
But why quote something that was said in a different context at a different time?
But it's not true today.
It is not true today. It is not true today because I can see that NREGA has virtually abolished hunger, mark my word, not poverty, abolished hunger in many parts of India. There is a woman or a man, an old woman sometimes, going home with 100 rupees in her hand after she's worked for the day. Now, hunger is gone in many parts of India. Poverty has not. I think some programs are clearly delivering. For example, the program under which we subsidize a woman and the health worker who brings the woman to an institution for delivering a baby, that's working. In Tamil Nadu, 95% of babies today are born in an institution, not in the home. That's a tremendous change. It has reduced infant mortality, maternal mortality. So some programs are working. Some programs are not working so well. And therefore we need to improve governance. We need to crack down on leakages. We need to hold people accountable. We need to have social audit. We need to have concurrent financial audits and ensure we get more bang for the buck. If we are spending 100 rupees, we must get full value for that 100 rupees, which is not happening in all programs.
Could I just ask you for your best estimate? If the government is spending 100 rupees on the poor, how much of that 100 rupees do you think actually reaches the poor?
It depends, program-wise. Let me tell you.
What is the range?
Laying roads. Now, this is the biggest swindle in the country. No more than 50% of the contracted amount is actually spent on the road. The swindle there is as much as 50%. But in NREGA, in the well-run states, I think the leakage is no more than about 5%. So I think it depends on program and program. Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan delivers well. We have got new schools, new classrooms, more teachers, more books, library. Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan delivers extremely well. Therefore, I think it depends on program to program. We can't generalize, but it depends on program to program and state to state.
Okay, so between 5 to 50% leakage. Salil, would you agree with that?
I'm not going to hazard and put a number and compete with Chidambaram's number on that. But I think I earlier said that, it's a very stratified situation in India. So the nice thing about that is that if you want to tackle poverty, it's very focused in particular social groups, highly concentrated in some geographical areas and some communities. So if you really want to crack it, if you can ensure that these people have access to information and access to justice, you're going a long way in dealing with it. Because these are also the places where we have the highest civil, social, political conflict right now. These are all very interlinked. But one point on China, which I wanted to make, which, I know it's rather unfashionable these days to say that one of the reasons that China had a more equitable starting point was land reform. Because the single means of production for agriculture which people had was more evenly distributed. My district in India, the South Canara district in where Mangalore is, was one of the few districts, and Kerala is the same, where you actually had very much more widely distributed land and good human capital investments. You see a very different result.
Right. Just getting the Chinese example on poverty redistribution programs, are there many, or has the poverty removal happened almost automatically as China has done?
China had also a very interesting experience. Obviously, at the beginning, all the poverty alleviation programs go to the money given to the poor. But you quickly find it's very different. Okay, you give the money to the poor. Some keep the money, particularly women. Women keep the money, open something, doing something. You give some money, some spend money on drinkings. And so year and year you realize the more important is you spend the money to transform these poor people become a meaningful use for labor. So then all the education, all the training programs set up, we're not going to money, but rather we try to help you, or we provide a certain supporting material, make yourself being independent. Okay. And that works well. Now obviously, but the majority role is still moving into the massive manufacturing. But let me. I would like to support my minister, and he's such a wonderful person. And I think the social program in India, in many areas in the past few years, it really works. But you need to divide the social program in two parts. One is for today's equality, and one is for tomorrow's growth and equality. You have to propose. But among them, I think India did a wonderful thing last year. First time you passed law, provided free education up to the year for aging 14. Well, it's very important. But go back to Michael's point of view. You say educating to women, I say educating to general, all the
of course.
This is more general. I think this is very important. They come to your point for the implementation, because if India wants sustainable inclusive growth for long term, you have to start really investing in education today, because the whole thing is, if you're looking for the futures, in 20 years horizon, what India has, India will be the only country will be able to provide 250 million fresh labor for the whole world. Right. Because all the demographic change in the advanced economy will have a negative labor growth. And China probably will be able to only 20% of their size, which is 50 million. So that's become the main resource of India. But you cannot wait for 20 years later. You have to do it today. Right. And but I think educate this 250 million people into the meaningful labor force and be able to create a value is absolutely a strategic issue for India tomorrow, and also strategic issue for tomorrow's whole world, because the world depends on the labor supply for India.
All right, that's a very valid point. Chanda, the question of redistribution programs or getting money to the poorest of the poor, I sometimes wonder, wouldn't it be just simpler to make sure that a lot of people actually have bank accounts and the direct cash transfers, which is another model that has sometimes been spoken about? Is that something which you think would eventually work more efficiently? And maybe now with the unique identification number which is coming out, can this system be made more efficient than it is today?
Yes, I think there is a huge scope for making the system much more efficient, because in the past, it was difficult to open a bank account if you did not have an identity of the person. And of course, the regulatory environment again was very tight, where you could not appoint agents and so on. But now, when you have a unique identity, you can identify the person, make sure you're opening a bank account in the name of the right person that exists, and then make sure that the money gets transferred to the person where it is supposed to go. So I think that can make a huge amount of difference. And on back of that, if we use technology to really allow money transfers to take place, I think you're not just making it available, you're making the whole thing very feasible for people to get the money where it is due.
Mike, you were nodding your head in violent agreement.
Well, no, I was nodding my head in violent agreement, exactly. The whole issue of banking in poor countries is incredibly interesting and amazingly innovative right now. I mean, one of the things that one's seeing in a number of countries in Africa, Kenya is the one that everyone quotes, but it's happening elsewhere, is just as we got used to the idea that mobile telephony was leapfrogging useless landlines in many parts of the developing world, now we're seeing mobile banking is leapfrogging traditional banking systems. So people are kind of being able to bank with their mobile phones. Safaricom in Kenya and others are kind of really kind of leading the way to kind of making credit available to very, very poor people without going through the business of building a network of bricks and mortar banks. So I think there's tremendous innovation that can be done, and this is one of the things that is happening throughout industry, is that you're increasingly seeing innovation in services and to an extent in manufacturing as well, not going from the rich world to what was the poor world, but going from the poor world to the rich world. And banking's a particularly exciting example.
Mr. Chidambaram, are there other solutions, whether it's a UID or other aspects that the government is actively working on to make sure that entire delivery mechanism works better? Even if the leakages come down to between 5 to 50%, I'm sure there's always a scope for improvement.
Well, I don't want this 5 to 50% summarizing of you to become the message from this discussion.
Okay.
Because I think what you're leaving out is, I said this is program specific and state specific. So I don't think we should.
I'm actually very intrigued by this word leakages, which is a euphemism that I hadn't been familiar with before, but which the word corruption has completely gone from my synapses, and I'm only going to say leakages.
Leakage is a slightly more polite way to say corruption.
Now,
but I let you say that.
See,
yes.
Decentralization, giving power to the lowest unit of administration.
Right.
And directly transferring money to them and leaving it to them to decide how the money should be spent is one way of ensuring that programs are implemented more efficiently and more effectively. Some subsidies can certainly be grouped and transferred as a cash subsidy rather than a program-specific subsidy. But some areas, the government would have to spend directly. For example, education, healthcare. These can't be given as per capita subsidies. We'll have to build the healthcare infrastructure, the education infrastructure, and then motivate people to use those services.
Can I just actually ask you a question on that? Because I think that's an extremely interesting point, and I'm sure you're right in saying that many of these services are implemented best if you kind of really direct the policy down to the lowest level, to the people who are closest to the people and so on. But doesn't that presume, not to dwell on the word leakages, doesn't that presume an extraordinarily effective decentralized public administration right down to the lowest village level?
It is. It is becoming more effective. Now we have had 3 rounds of elections in the last 12 years. 1/3 of all elected officials are women. Many of them, most of them are literate women. And younger people are, in fact, there are even highly qualified MBAs who go back and get elected as village officials. Therefore, I think if you give them the power, the funds, the functions, and the functionaries, and ask them to implement these programs, for example, roads, school education, basic health care, drinking water, sanitation. These are best done by these units of administration rather than the vertical pillars running from the state capital down to the village.
That's always, I guess, assuming that those also work effectively, because sometimes these units also do have leakages or corruption.
But by and large, you see, my experience is when the village assembly meets together, when the whole village gets together and then decides, by and large, they tend to decide in favor of the greatest good for the greatest number.
Can I come in on that quickly?
Also, there's a direct accountability, I think.
Right. I just want to, before I come back to all of you, I just want to broaden it a little bit, and I want to welcome one of our partners, Randy Zuckerberg of Facebook out here, who's been running some special polls on what people out there actually think about this. And Randy, you asked a couple of questions, didn't you? One was about why is there still so much poverty in India, and 2, what can be done about it?
That's right. Thank you for the excellent discussion. We've asked thousands of people in India on Facebook, why is poverty still prevalent in India? Legacy of colonialism, liberalization has led to inequality or corruption at the grassroots level. We saw 83% of our respondents said corruption at the grassroots level.
83% said corruption at the grassroots level.
But there is a very big distinction when you look at age. People between the 18 to 34 demographic were much more likely to respond corruption, and females were much more likely to respond.
Right. You asked the second question, didn't you, which was about what can be done about it? What did that throw up?
That's right. The question was, how can India ensure inclusive growth? The answer choices were trickle-down effect will do so automatically, aggressive state intervention, or ending corruption. Again, ending corruption was the largest response, and again, a huge age difference, but this time we saw people ages 35 and older responded 93% response rate for ending corruption.
And this was a poll done in India. So I wonder whether there would be different results if it happened outside India.
That's right. So we're actually running in real time right now those same questions to people on Facebook outside India. So hopefully we'll have some results soon.
Okay, so if you have some results, we'll come back to you a little later in this together.
Can I respond to that? You have to define grassroots there. The grassroots there refers to that petty official in the official administrative system. If that grassroots is redefined as village elected bodies, the result would be very different.
But I think the important point to note from this is that at least within India, there is it comes through from that if there is still poverty, people blame it largely still on corruption. Of course, it has to be said this is an internet audience, it's not necessarily what the masses would say, but with all those health warnings, there is certainly within India a perception that corruption is what is still leading to so much poverty, and corruption is what will prevent India from becoming more inclusive as we go forward. It's perhaps a reflection of the mood in India right now, but do you think that's how would you respond to that result?
Yeah, I've already responded. I think this refers to corruption in the official machinery.
Right.
And the broad perception is the official machinery is corrupt. And the Facebook audience who you targeted perhaps have that perception to a greater degree than those who are, at the villages or in the mohallas.
Okay.
I think,
which is one of the reasons why I argue, and I still argue, that we must entrust functions and funds to local units of administration of elected representatives of the people.
I
And give them
agree
5,
with,
6 functions to perform.
I think there's just to finish on this point, I think when people say corruption, it's not just the monetary corruption, it's the accountability question. That if something is not reaching them, who do they hold accountable? And I think Minister said that earlier. That is a very big challenge. It's not just a money question. And for the people who we talked about earlier, if you're a Dalit woman in a remote rural area, then you can imagine how this accountability mechanism will work. And we've been talking quite a lot about the supply side. How do we improve the implementation mechanism? I totally agree that the more we bring it closer to the ground, the better it is. But the big challenge we have is on the demand side. People are not aware of their rights. They're not raising their voice. And when they raise their voice, if that is suppressed at a very local level, that's where you have the biggest problem. The solution to corruption and accountability is for people to become more aware, for information to be available to them. Because however much you find supply-side solutions, people will find a way of getting around it.
Are people raising their voice or are they not? I guess the question is that they can always vote in elections. And increasingly, you are seeing governments that are delivering better, especially at the state level, being voted back. It happened in Bihar, and I see NK Singh out there. I'm just going to ask him about that as well.
50% of elected representatives are defeated in the next election.
But I think that's one trend. But the other trend, which is also interesting, is that now there's a pro-incumbency wave.
Where there's a perception that governments are delivering, they tend to get re-elected.
Okay. Chanda, one of the aspects of this is corruption, which is being spoken about so much. There are really two types of corruption. One is big bang corruption, scams, which are, happens at a much larger level. And then there's the day-to-day corruption, which sometimes affects the poorest of the poor even more. When they're not getting their rights, they're not getting what they deserve, money for their schools or their roads, or a local hospital is, being eaten away, where they have to pay a bribe to get basic licenses or their land records. That sometimes is what really hurts the poor even more.
Yeah, in a way we discussed about this, that the more you take, therefore, implementation to the ground level, there is a phase to accountability, and therefore, that can change the delivery effectiveness. But I think we're talking of two things here. One is, when we talk of corruption in a poll like this, I think what people are meaning by their response is to say that out of the money spent, yes, we will get much better, if there is much more accountability. I think that's one part. But when we are debating the whole issue of inclusiveness, the second and the bigger part is that we anyway have to do much more to make growth inclusive. So, it's not just that with the amount that we are doing today, can we just get to the amount of removal of poverty by taking away corruption? I think there is anyway much more to be done in terms of all the initiatives that we spoke about.
All right. Mike?
No,
I'm using the corruption word and not calling it.
No, I've stopped using the corruption word. No, I think it's I think we're having an extremely interesting debate, and I absolutely agree with the minister. I mean, I think the central point here of kind of trying to drive services down to the lowest level, where they're effective, where accountability has a human face, is beyond question the right way to go. All I'm saying is that I think there are issues, not just in India, but anywhere in the world, that one has to do that to make sure that public administration down to local village level is as good as it can possibly be.
Mr. Zuman, would you? This is a problem that happens elsewhere. It's a problem
Surely
that is
does.
still happening in China as well. It's not that China is delivering absolutely smooth and transparent governance all the way down.
Certainly not.
Certainly, corruption is a global issue in all different areas, different stages. And transparency, accountability, education is the most, and empower the people is the most effective way.
And another area where technology can help, actually, and even in poor countries, or even in poor parts of countries, technology can help. Mobile technology can empower people in ways that we're only really just kind of coming to understand as it impacts the political and governmental structures of a country.
All right, let me just throw this open to the audience now. Anybody with views? The lady there, if anybody has a question, you can just introduce yourself and then I'll...
Thank you very much. My name is Malini Mehra, and I'd like to stick with this issue of corruption. Because as you've seen from that survey is something that I think most of the Indians in this audience can actually identify with. I don't know why we're tiptoeing around this, and I don't know why our political and economic elites are so defensive of this. We just need to be grown up and recognize that this is an abiding chronic cancer in our society which holds us back. Mike, I want to pick up on your points about technology responding to this. So, we as young people and as people who are making the future of India are totally fed up with it. In Bangalore, we have an initiative where actually if you are forced to pay a bribe, whether it's to a private individual or a public servant, we can now send messages to one another with the subject heading, I paid a bribe. Right. You get that information out into the public domain, and it sends a signal to the authorities. We're not putting up with this.
All right.
Fantastic.
You want to respond to that, Mr. Chidambaram?
Well, I think you should raise your voice louder and make more people do that. I would certainly support any section of the people joined together and carrying a campaign against corruption. I think you should not only say, I paid a bribe, you should say, I paid a bribe to so-and-so. You should give us name and address and this telephone number, so people will call him and tell him, why did you take a bribe?
You could GPS him at the precise kind of intersection in Bangalore.
More the better.
Little cell phone photograph of him, you're away.
Mr. Srivastava?
Hi, Saurav Srivastava here. I just wanted to mention, for each country it has its different strengths and weaknesses. China has its own in how it can implement its governance mechanism, style, governance systems. In India, I think our biggest single strength is a very entrepreneurial culture at the grassroots. And if you look at the growth, it's really come from our entrepreneurs. And I would say that we have another unique scenario where healthcare and education, which in most parts of the world are largely government-run, in India are largely run by the private sector. So I would say perhaps we should focus in India on what is it we can do in our legislation, in our policy mechanisms, in our encouragement to get more and more entrepreneurs more and more actively involved, even in these basic sectors, because they're in there and they're doing them well.
Can I just respond to that?
Sure.
Only because yesterday afternoon I moderated a 2-hour-long session on Italy, not on India, and on Italy, where, to be honest, some of the same questions came up. I don't know why the Italian is for leakages, but I should probably find out. But one of the very interesting points that was made was India, of course, has a rich, deep, and wonderful entrepreneurial culture. But in the end, you can't ask entrepreneurs to, as it were, manage around an official system that doesn't work, because there will become a point where no matter how many wonderful entrepreneurs you've got, you run against kind of official roadblocks, whether it's corruption or something else, that just choke growth. And that I think, is where I'm not saying this is true in India, but it is certainly where many Italian businesses think they now are.
I didn't mean this as a silver bullet, but when you have critical mass of this entrepreneurial activity, it puts too much pressure on the system. It's much more powerful than the person on the street.
All right. Mr. N. Kissing, if I can just get you in on that point, do you think increasingly a lot of the answers of what we've been talking about actually depend with the state governments? And at the state government level, is there now a major electoral incentive to actually try and deliver on some of these issues, whether it's education of women and the girl child or other issues? Is it the state government where the real answer lies?
Well, I think that the broad consensus in this group, I think that Mr. Chidambaram's point that a lot varies on local conditions, a lot varies in the quality of governance. But in the state of Bihar, for instance, I think that starting from a very low base, the incumbent government was voted back to power with a resounding majority because it was a happier confluence of sensible economics and sensible politics at the point where inclusive growth is what made that confluence possible, which paid special emphasis on better quality of implementation, on policies targeted to the marginalized groups, on making women a more central theme in the entire development matrix. And therefore, when people realize that life quality with better environment, better security conditions, better roads, better health, better education really work, I think for the first time, it cut deep into what was traditionally identity politics, by politics replaced by the development matrix.
Right. One last question, perhaps, Mr. K.P. Singh?
Well, in my view, sir, that the main point I think we are missing here, and that is that in addition to what government is doing, what they should be doing, and corruption is related to government working. But I think the main issue is what role is corporate India doing? And what is the mindset of people? In India, our mindset, unfortunately so far, is not one of giving charity. But as growth has taken place, I can tell you there is a big awakening in the corporate sector and in people. Lots and lots of corporate sector, CSR activities are being done to make people employable. Idea is what steps you take to make them to earn money. And I think that is a contribution more private sector can play than solely the government.
Right. Randy Zuckerberg, I'm going to come back to you. Do you have any updates on what the rest of the world thinks about this issue? Any different to what people within India feel?
Sure. So I should say that this is only hitting a few time zones because we've run this so quickly. But we are seeing still the majority of people are saying corruption at the grassroots level, but significantly more people than before are saying liberalization has led to inequality. So we are seeing some differences there. Likewise, how can India ensure inclusive growth? Ending all corruption went from 80% of the answers down to 54% of the answers, and trickle-down effect will happen automatically has risen to almost 40%.
All right, so liberalization, is it at all to blame for the problems of poverty, and will trickle-down effect solve this by itself at some point or other? I just want to get final comments from the entire panel. I'm going to start with you, Salil, and move in this direction.
Can I just say that I don't think that corruption in India is a preserve of the government, because I don't think industry or the corporate sector is that free of blame, and it's citizens. I mean, people are also paying. Somebody is receiving, so it's a societal challenge. But I'm happy that it was mentioned that what are companies going to do about being inclusive? Are they inclusive? Whom are they employing? When we know that socially these people are very specific, Adivasis, Muslims, and so we don't like reservations in the private sector because everyone gets very scared with that idea. We have it in the government, but the Prime Minister has, started a process to push to think about these issues. So if they don't do self-regulation, this is going to come through external regulation.
Okay, Mike,
I think this is an important debate because just as you can't have two Indias, you can't have two anywheres. And I think one of the very interesting themes below the surface at Davos this year, as you men and I were talking about it right at the beginning of the conference, is growing inequality as a key policy area for concern, not just in nations like India or, for that matter, in China, where inequality is growing very fast, but actually in developed countries like the United States. Sometimes the euphemism used for this is disparities of income. I prefer just to say inequality, but I think inequality is becoming a genuine and important and crucial part of the economic development debate. So I think sessions like the one that we've had today really contribute to thinking about how we can navigate our way through it.
All right, Chanda, very briefly, final
I'd
thoughts.
say India is currently at a very sweet spot where clearly the very strong fundamental factors are driving India's growth. So instead of getting caught up in debates of throwing the blame onto different segments, let's use this opportunity to look ahead and say, how do we make growth inclusive? And let all of us realize our responsibility. And let us say how public-private partnership can work here in every field, whether it's health, whether it's education, whether it's training, whether it's expanding the sources of employment. Rather than saying that there are government schools that are not working well, can we provide the additional support and make them work well? So I would say let's not here put the ball back and forth. Let's say that as a nation, it's important for us to make growth inclusive, and let's work in public-private partnership. It's a responsibility for everybody, and it's an opportunity for everybody.
All right, zoom in.
Yeah, just to repeat what I said. I think that the key issue for this debating is really pay much more attention on India's young labor forces, the youth. Because, from all levels, policy level, corporate level, community level, a lot of educations, a lot of trainings to make sure this young generation, young people will be proper qualified labor force and properly employed in the future industries. I think it's absolutely important strategy for India and absolutely important strategy for the world. Because the war we're pending on is a 200 million India labor force for the whole world tomorrow.
So Chidambaram, final thoughts from you. And by the way, is that something which the government is treating as one of its top priority, making sure that that labor force which is going to emerge is going to be absolutely ready to take its place on the global stage?
Well, answering that point, we have a massive, huge skill development program, which is a public-private partnership. We are trying to create 50 million skilled persons to do the jobs that are required in our industrial society. But it's going to take time. Now, my broad conclusion would be like this. Yes, we acknowledge our faults. We acknowledge our weaknesses. We must also acknowledge that in an open, competitive economic system, inequalities will rise. Numbers show that in the United States, about 70% of the additional income that has accrued in the last 5 to 10 years has gone to 1% of the population. The Singapore minister told me that in Singapore, 90% of the additional income has gone to the top 5% of Singapore's population. That is why we need not only to promote growth, because growth will promote inequalities. The faster growing sectors, industry and services, will generate higher incomes. The laggard sector, which is agriculture, that income has to be distributed. So you need redistribution policies, which is why the state has a key role to play. I welcome corporate social responsibility. I welcome public-private partnership, but please don't underestimate the role of the state. State is redefined, going down to the lowest unit. To Saurabh's point, I think factually there's an error in that statement. The bulk of India's healthcare and the bulk of India's education system is still in the public sector. In fact, it is the public sector doctors who helped wipe out the worst diseases in India, the endemic diseases, before private corporate hospitals came. Okay. And today, public sector schools run by municipalities, panchayats, produce as good students as private schools. So I think the role of the state cannot be underestimated or wished away. Point is, the state must become more accountable, right, more honest, better governance, and better elected representatives to deliver better governance.
All right, Mr. Chidambaram, I think no one would wish away the state or the state's role, but as you said, perhaps a bit more efficient, perhaps a bit more transparent would of course be better. Thank you all so much for having joined us on this panel. This debate and discussion will of course continue. You can log on to ndtv.com where that poll is going to continue to run, and you can also post your comments on what you thought about this entire subject. Thank you all so much for having been with us. Bye for now.
Thank you.
Thank you.